Hey, so this video will be the overview video. Looks a bit crooked, so I'll fix that. The overview video for Week 6 Reading List A on World War I and its aftermath. So my sense is that for the US, World War I was a comparatively minor event. Like, yes, we fought for about a year. Yes, we were involved. We made a lot of money, so people liked that. But by and large, it wasn't that big a deal. For Europeans, World War I was psychologically shattering. There had been small wars in Europe, small conflicts in Europe and its colonies throughout the 1800s, early 1900s, but no one was prepared for a world war with modern technology and modern weapons. So basically, and it becomes a world war because of a series of alliances and empires. So the war begins basically because of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip, who was a Serbian nationalist, member of the organization known as the Black Hand. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire is pissed off at Serbia, and they declare war on Serbia. The Russians, who are Slavs, who are the same ethnicity as the Serbians, declare war on Austria-Hungary to protect Serbia. And then because Austria-Hungary is allied with Germany, Germany declares war on Russia, and because France and Britain are allied with Russia, they declare war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Turks join in on behalf of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and then a bunch of smaller countries get involved on different sides. Part of the problem is that most of these nations have empires. So when Britain declares war, it's not just the island of Britain declaring war, it is the British Empire declaring war. So you have troops coming from South Africa, from Australia, from West Africa, what would now be Nigeria, Ghana, and countries like that. You have troops coming from Kenya, you have troops coming from the Caribbean, you have troops coming from India and Burma. And so this is a massive war that spreads basically across the globe. There's fighting in Africa, there's fighting in Asia, there's fighting in Europe. There's a certain amount of sort of intelligence gathering and intrigue and things like this in North America. And then there's fighting on the oceans, like across the world's oceans. The problem ultimately becomes that the war is brutal. World War I is characterized primarily by trench warfare. And so basically what happens is the Germans invade Belgium to get to France because it's the easiest way for them to get into France. Because the French have sort of a fairly heavily fortified border with Germany because they've had a series of wars. They're not as concerned about the Belgians. And so Germany invades Belgium and northern France, and basically that's where the battle lines stay from 1914 to 1918. So that's the Western Front. The Eastern Front is sort of Eastern Europe, and basically it's a long trench line along the borders between Germany and Russia, and Austria-Hungary and Russia. And so basically what ends up happening is the trenches become horrific places to live. They are muddy, they are wet, they are cold in the winter, they are exposed to the sun in the summer. You are subject to periodic artillery bombardments. Communications are frequently disrupted. It's hard to get supplies in and out. So people, like, there's a ton of stories from World War I of people, like, living on the rats that are in the trenches. Medical care is extremely difficult because it's hard to move people in and out. And then the main tactic used by both sides was what was known as going over the top. And essentially, what this involved, and this was a brilliant strategy, was to have everybody in your army climb out of the trench and walk across the territory known as No Man's Land, which was the territory between the two trenches. So basically they would walk across it, or they would run if they wanted to, and try and get to the other side's trench. The problem with it was that No Man's Land was full of barbed wires, it was full of mines, and then everybody would get machine gunned in the first 10 seconds after they got out of their trench. So hundreds of thousands of people died in this fighting because the strategy was basically, we're just going to send you to charge fortified positions, and then when you all get killed, whoever survives is going to go back to our trench, and then at some point they'll charge us and we'll machine gun them down. So fairly quickly in the war there developed this sense among the soldiers that the war was a futile effort, that it was a death sentence to go over the top, that you would not make it to the enemy trench, you would get killed, and the generals and their staff were fine with that. It was business as usual for them. So there's a tremendous amount of disillusionment that came with the incredibly poor management of the conflict. The other part of the sort of disillusionment and the horror of World War I was the new technologies that were developed to make war more inhumane. This was the first time that we saw tanks in action. So tanks were meant to be the sort of death blow kind of weapon that would completely destroy the enemy and help win the war. In reality, they were a fairly brutal innovation. This was the first time we saw large-scale air combat. So flight had been invented, airplanes had been invented in the early 1900s. By 1914, militaries started using them initially for reconnaissance and then for sort of dropping, basically like hand-dropping bombs on the enemy. And then at some point they mounted machine guns on them and you would have sort of air combat. But probably one of the most terrifying innovations of the war was poison gas. So a lot of times it was chlorine gas, but they would use toxic gases loaded into artillery shells that would be fired into the enemy lines, and then this poison gas would spread out, and it would basically burn out soldiers' lungs, eyes, the inside of your throat, all of this stuff. And it was one of the most horrific ways to die, but it was also one of those deaths where if you died from it, you were probably lucky, because there were also people who lived after gas attacks whose lungs were all burned up and whose throats were destroyed by it, and it was an incredibly painful life after this type of injury, if you managed to survive it. So there was this incredible brutality and this sense in the trenches among the common soldiers that it was a never-ending sort of experience of hell. And so we get, after this war, we get widespread, what was called shell shock. Today it would be called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And we now know all about it, and we accept that it's a thing. And while it almost doubtlessly happened after other wars, this was the first time that we had a sort of widespread acknowledgement that it was a psychological condition. And partially this is because people like Sigmund Freud and his disciples are working in the World War I era, and Freud actually works with a lot of soldiers who come back from World War I and have these horrific nightmares and flashbacks and things like this. And they start to develop this sense of shell shock or PTSD as a distinct psychological condition. So the horror of World War I is embedded in the minds of the soldiers, even those who survive. And this gives shape to the High Modernist movement. So, I mean, again, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, Mrs. Dalloway, Ulysses by James Joyce, these sort of high modernist texts that are about the loss of faith, loss of humanity, fragmentation of culture, and things like this. This is all connected to what we would call the lost generation. And the lost generation would be the generation of young men about 16, 17 through about 30 who get decimated in World War I, like massive casualties, massive numbers of these young men killed, and then those who make it home, large numbers of those people have shell shock, have PTSD, and have trouble sort of readjusting to life after the war. And so this all contributes to High Modernism and this sense of despair, this sense of loss, this sense of fragmentation that marks modernist literature and art.